Why do this with one arm tied behind your back?
You can't ramp up modern munitions and get them on the battlefield very quickly.
President Zelensky is heavily dependent on U.S. military aid.
Their coffers are not full, and Zelensky is in a slugfest with the Russians.
Now to the war in Ukraine, which has gotten very expensive for the U.S. Yesterday, the White House announced another $325 million in military aid to Ukraine. The U.S. has sent about $75 billion in aid to Ukraine since the Russian invasion started. And support for this heavy spending, however, is seeing strains, especially among some conservative Republicans who are calling for aid to stop entirely. We're joined now by Representative Don Bacon, Republican of Nebraska. Congressman, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate you.
Okay, so you've been a strong supporter of aid to Ukraine, but as I mentioned, some of your Republican colleagues are opposed to it, saying they don't want to send a blank check to a non-NATO country. What would you say in response to their argument?
I'm a Reagan Republican. Reagan stood up to the Russians, the Soviet Union at the time, and it helped bring the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it helped create an independent Ukraine. We stand up to bullies as Republicans or as Americans, frankly, and we try to help those who are being victimized. We, with 8% of what we spend on an annual basis for defense over 2 years, we have decimated about half of Russia's tanks, a good number of their armored personnel carriers, roughly 100 different aircraft, many more, or I should say jet fighters, even more helicopters, 300,000 casualties. We have tremendously weakened Ukraine, but we are doing it not so much to, or we weakened Russia, excuse me. We're not doing this to weaken Russia. We're trying to convince them, though, to stop the invasion of their neighbor, an innocent country. And if we fail at this, I believe the Baltic states will be at risk, could be Poland, Moldavia. We've already seen Georgia, where the Russians invaded portions of that country. You got to stand up to the bully, in my view. And a lot of the arguments against doing this, I think about 3/4 of them are false. It's propaganda right out of the Kremlin. There's probably one or two good arguments that I think we should be able to debate, but most of them are not even truthful.
So President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine was in Washington yesterday lobbying Congress, to give more money to Ukraine. And President Biden sent him home, as I mentioned, with $325 million military aid. Do you think that we're giving them, though, what they need to win the war, not just sustain this war?
President Biden's always been about 3 to 5 months late on giving the actual needs of what Ukraine should have. He's always late to the fight. He was, that November before the invasion, we had the intelligence Russia was going to invade. He would not give them any aid or very minimal aid because he didn't want to escalate. After the invasion, it was the same thing. It took like 3 or 4 months after the invasion where he started to pivot. But even now, he's late on some of the weapons that would make the biggest impact. I am a big advocate for ATACMS. These things have a 190-mile range and could hit, Russian, depots where they have their weapons stored, where they have their troops congregated, ships that would be in the Crimea, ports there. The ATACMS could be a game changer, but the president continually drags his feet on it. Now, I heard today, again, that they may be reconsidering this, but why do this with one arm tied behind your back? And that's what he's done with Ukraine the entire way. He's given enough to create gridlock with maybe incremental gains for Ukraine, but he could be given weapons that could be game changers, and he has not done that.
We're joined now by a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Navy, Captain Chuck Nash, who's a military and national security analyst. Captain Nash, welcome back to the show.
Always a pleasure, Lindsay.
All right, so President Zelensky is heavily dependent on U.S. military aid. So what happens if the flow of American money does slow down?
Well, then he's in big trouble because if you look at our European allies, the NATO allies who are also supplying him, you'll recall that when they went into Libya to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, that lasted about 3 days before they ran out of ammunition. And the United States had to jump in and bail out the whole effort. Well, a lot of that has not changed because they have not been keeping up with their spending limits, which should be somewhere around 2 to 3% of their gross domestic product. They haven't been doing it. So their coffers are not full, and Zelensky is in a slugfest with the Russians. And when I say a slugfest, I mean it's a heavy artillery duel back and forth, and he is running through ammunition like crazy because it's an old style dig in slugfest. It's not land maneuver with air over top and all that. No, it's more like World War I trench warfare than it is maneuver warfare.
Well, and speaking of that, eventually Ukraine could actually run short on troops. And that's something the U.S., as you know, is not willing to supply. So what happens then?
Yeah. Well, then, hopefully before that happens, they find a way to exit this where both sides can pull back. And that's not going to happen if the Russians have to give up the land bridge that they've built from the Donbass all the way south through Mariupol and now down into the Crimea. That was their first and foremost, that was their objective, is to secure a land bridge to Crimea. Now that they have it, they're not going to give it up. And I think what's going to happen is the Ukrainians are going to have to realize that they can either slaughter generations of their young men or just live with the fact that those predominantly Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic areas of eastern Ukraine are going to be pulled back into the Russian Federation.
Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa, Republican, who's on the Armed Services Committee, she said this. She said the U.S. should be the arsenal of democracy and provide what Ukraine needs in order to win the war, but our European friends and allies can step up with humanitarian aid. Captain, is that a realistic strategy and a good one at that?
Well, we went through a downsizing of the defense industry. There were probably, I'm going to guess at a number, maybe 112 different defense companies way back when. There are now 7 really big ones and a lot of small mom and pop suppliers. So you can't ramp up modern munitions and get them on the battlefield very quickly. In fact, Raytheon has had to call people back who had retired to build the shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. So this is a very difficult problem, and everybody likes to talk tactics and politics, but it's logistics that wins wars. And that's where the Ukrainians are right now. They're in a slugfest, they're running through ammunition, and the arsenal of democracy has been reluctant to supply them early on and push stuff to them. That's what we should be doing right now with Taiwan, and not get caught flat-footed if the Chinese threaten to do something kinetically.